You're standing in a shield wall. Elephants scream somewhere on your left. Cavalry is kicking up a wall of dust ahead of you. Every eye in your unit is on the enemy's heavy infantry, waiting for the collision. Nobody is looking at the line of men standing 100 meters back on the far side of the field, holding nothing you'd recognize. As a weapon, no swords, no spears, no bows, just leather straps hanging loose in their hands and small pouches of stones at their feet. Then the man next to you drops. No warning, no sound you can place, no arrow sticking out of him, just gone mid-sentence, a dent in his skull the size of a fist. You never even saw what hit him. Nobody did. It came from too far away, moving too fast, thrown by someone who never had to get close enough for you to fight back, and who is already reaching for the next stone. That's the sling. 2 cords, a scrap of leather, and a rock. It is, without argument, one of the least respected weapons in the history of warfare and one of the most effective. Historians write books about the bow. Museums build entire wings around swords. The sling barely gets a footnote, usually attached to one story about a shepherd boy and a giant, and yet for most of human history, across nearly every inhabited continent, it may have been the deadliest thing you could hold in one hand. So why doesn't it have a name people know? Why does something that could reportedly kill at a distance most archers couldn't touch get remembered as a toy? Start with what it actually is, because that's the first surprise. There's no blade, no moving parts, no mechanism to fail. A sling is a cord folded in half, with a small pouch woven into the middle to cradle a stone, and a loop at one end that slips over a finger. That's the entire weapon. You could build one from a shoelace and a piece of a boot. It looks like nothing. It looks like a child's toy, which is exactly the trap it sets. Here's what that toy is actually doing to a rock. When you swing a sling overhead, you're not just throwing harder, you're changing the geometry of the throw itself. Your arm gives you a lever roughly 2 feet long. The sling adds another 2, 3, sometimes 4 feet of cord on top of that, and every extra inch of that radius multiplies the speed at the far end. Spin something fast enough on a long enough cord, and by the time it leaves the pouch, it's moving at a fraction of what your bare arm could ever produce on its own. A fist punch from a trained boxer carries a certain amount of force. A thrown spear carries more. A stone flung from a sling even. One weighing barely more than a golf ball can arrive carrying more than either, because the sling isn't relying on muscle at the point of impact. It's relying on physics that had 2 or 3 extra feet to build speed before your muscle even finished its job. Ballistics researchers who've run the numbers on this have compared the resulting impact to a modern handgun's stopping power, not a metaphor, a calculation. A fist-sized stone launched by a human arm with nothing but string, hitting with the force of a weapon we now regulate and lock in a safe. If you like finding out that ancient people were smarter and scarier than we give them credit for, subscribe, because the next part is where scientists proved they'd been underestimating this thing for decades. Now here's the part that should be simple and isn't. How old is it? For a spear, you can dig up the wood. For a stone axe, the stone itself is the fossil. The sling is built from cord and leather rot. They vanish, which means the sling might be one of the oldest weapons humans ever built, and we have almost no way to prove it. The oldest actual slings ever recovered, woven leather and fiber pulled intact from the ground, are only a few thousand years old, found on the coast of Peru and in the tomb of a teenage pharaoh. But the ammunition tells a different story. In Israel, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of sling stones, shaped and smoothed to an identical, deliberately aerodynamic profile dating back over 7,000 years, standardized, mass-produced, built to a pattern by people who understood exactly what shape lies straight and what shape wobbles off course. That's not the beginning of the sling. That's just the earliest point where the weapon happened to leave something solid enough to survive. The sling itself, the part that actually did the work, is missing from every dig on Earth older than a few thousand years, not because it wasn't there, but because it was never going to last long enough for anyone to find it. The real beginning is lost, buried in the part of the technology that rotted away before it could become evidence. For a long time, even the researchers who studied the sling seriously underestimated it. Older assumptions put its effective range at somewhere between 30 and 60 meters, not much better than an early bow, which is part of why it never got taken as seriously in the history books. Then, a little over a decade ago, a researcher rebuilt slings from scratch, trained with them for months, and re-ran the tests properly out in an open field with real projectiles instead of theoretical models. The stones didn't stop at 60 meters. They kept flying past 170. The entire scholarly picture of what this weapon could do had been wrong by a factor of 3-4 years because nobody had actually thrown one hard enough or trained long enough to find its real ceiling. And once you know that, the history stops sounding like exaggeration. It starts sounding like the record was simply incomplete, written by people who never bothered to test the thing they were dismissing. The Balearic Islands produced slingers so feared that Carthage recruited them by the thousands, and Hannibal marched them across the Alps alongside his elephants. Boys there reportedly weren't given breakfast until they'd knocked it off a wall with a stone from a distance. That's not folklore about toughness, that's what it actually takes to make a weapon this precise into muscle memory. You start before you can read, and you keep practicing until missing feels wrong in your body. At the Battle of Cannae, the single worst day of Roman military history, a sling stone to the head is what took a Roman consul out of the fight before the real slaughter had even started. And when Rome finally decided to conquer the Balearic Islands themselves, their solution wasn't heavier armor. It was wrapping their own ships in leather hide, just to blunt the impact of stones being thrown from the shore before a single legionary had set foot on the beach. They weren't defending against arrows, they were defending against rocks thrown by farmers and shepherds, and they still had to pad the hull to survive the approach. Rome eventually stopped fighting these slingers and started hiring them instead, folding them into the legions as permanent auxiliary units for the next several hundred years, a standing admission that this was not a weapon worth facing twice. Centuries later, a Roman military writer would go so far as to argue that every soldier in the empire, not just specialists, should be trained to use one, because it was too effective to leave to a handful of foreign auxiliaries. But for every army that used the sling to end a war, there were far more ordinary people using it just to keep their families fed and alive. This wasn't primarily a soldier's weapon. It was a shepherd's tool first, and a soldier's weapon second. Long before anyone slung a stone at another human being, someone slung one at a wolf circling a flock, or a fox getting too close to the herd, and the person doing it might have been 11 years old. That's the real reason the sling spread to nearly every continent humans occupied. It doesn't require a blacksmith, a bowyer, or years of specialized training just to hold correctly. It requires string, a pouch, and time. A child can carry one. An old man who can no longer draw a bow can still sling a stone with deadly accuracy because the technique is timing and rotation, not raw strength. High in the Andes today, herders still braid slings from wool and alpaca fiber, using patterns passed down for generations to move llamas and alpacas across mountain trails. The same physics, the same motion, still working exactly as it did before anyone wrote anything down. Fewer people learn to weave one properly every year. The knowledge is quietly running out in real time, while almost nobody outside those villages is watching it go. So if it was this effective, this widespread, and this easy to learn, why did it disappear from the story we tell about ancient weapons? Partly because it left almost nothing behind for anyone to put in a display case. A stone spearhead is unmistakably a weapon the moment you see it, shaped, sharpened, obviously built for violence. A sling stone, more often than not, is just a stone. Round, smooth, unremarkable. The kind you'd walk past on a riverbank without a second. Look, even though the difference between that stone and an ordinary one might be the difference between someone dying that day and someone not, there's no dramatic artifact to photograph, no elegant edge to admire under glass, and the people who used it most, herders and shepherds and the poorest ranks of ancient armies, weren't the ones getting elaborate burials or having their exploits carved into monuments. The sword got myths. The bow got legends. The sling got one verse in an old story about a boy who used it to win a fight everyone assumed he'd lose, and that single anecdote is now nearly the entire cultural memory of a weapon that armies feared enough to armor their own ships against. That's the actual lesson buried in all of this, and it has nothing to do with stones. The deadliest tool doesn't have to look dangerous. It doesn't need a blade, a bang, or a name people fear. It just needs to convert a small amount of human effort into a very large amount of force and let physics finish the job quietly. That principle didn't end with the sling. It's the same idea behind a trebuchet flinging boulders over a castle wall centuries later, and it's the same math engineers are now floating in concepts for slinging payloads into orbit, spinning them up on a tether until they're moving fast enough to leave the atmosphere entirely without burning a drop of fuel to get there. Different scale, same trick. Find a way to add length to the arm and let rotation do what muscle alone never could. Somewhere on a mountainside in the Andes right now, someone is still braiding one by hand, the same way it's been done for thousands of years, to move animals across a slope. It doesn't look like much. It never did. That was always the point.